Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part B. In sight, in mind, but far away in time. The Untold Stories of Ancient Jerusalem. Chapter 3. The Untold Story of David's Conquest of Jerusalem. The biblical description in 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 5, verses 6 to 10, of the conquest of Jerusalem in the days of David is plain, difficult, and seemingly distorted. I would like to offer a literal translation of the very problematic Hebrew Masoretic text, and I'm reading. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, except you take away the blind and the lame, who are saying, David will not come in here." Nevertheless, David seized the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever smites a Jebusite, let him touch the water tunnel, and the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul. Therefore, it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house." And David dwelled in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built around from the Millo inward. And David continued to grow greater and greater, and Yahweh, the God of hosts, was with him. End of quote. The story, as it is in the Masoretic text, seems problematic and uneven, and it clearly has late additions, some of which are intended to associate this foreign place with David and his dynasty. Thus, for example, in verses 6 and 7, 4 different names are written for the city. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusite, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, David took Metzudat Zion, usually translated as the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. The text seeks to identify Jerusalem with the city of the Jebusites, the ancient people who populated the city until its conquest by David, since in the biblical language, Metzudah, usually translated as stronghold, is a designation for a place of refuge and protection, and not necessarily a strong fortress. This implies that after the conquest of the city, it became David's place of refuge and protection, the stronghold of Zion, and the text identifies the same place of refuge, stronghold, with the city of David. The text states that the conquest of Jerusalem made it the place of David's stronghold, and he established its capital there by turning it into his city, the city of David. The symbolism of the text, and perhaps also the evidence of the lateness of this description, is also evident in the use of the very rare name Zion for the same stronghold that David captured, which is called here the stronghold of Zion, and is identified with the city of David. As noted earlier, the name Zion is mentioned only 4 times in the Deuteronomistic historiography out of 154 times it appears in the entire Hebrew Bible. Indeed, it is a name that appears mainly in prophetic literature and biblical poetry. Notably, of all the occurrences of Zion in the Bible, it is mentioned 46 times in the book of Isaiah and 39 times in Psalms. Thus, over half of its appearances in the Old Testament occur within these 2 books alone. Apart from that, Zion is also mentioned 17 times in the book of Jeremiah, 15 times in the book of Lamentation, as well as few times in the books of the prophets Micah, Yoel, Obadiah, Zechariah, Amos, and Zephaniah. In the historiographical literature, Zion mentioned in the context of the stronghold of Zion in the currently discussed story of David's conquest of Jerusalem, second book of Samuel, chapter 5, verse 7, where verse 9 relates to, and David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the city of David. Also, in 1 Kings 8, verse 1, the name Zion appears in parallel to the city of David. After the construction of the temple was completed, the description links again the city of David with Zion. I'm reading. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of Yahweh out of the city of David, which is Zion. Twice more, the name Zion appears in the words of the prophet Isaiah in the second book of Kings 19, verses 21 and 31. In his sarcastic response to the Assyrian belief that they are destined to conquer Jerusalem. Here, too, the linguistic combinations of the term Zion are unique and are mentioned in parallel to the city's name, Jerusalem. In verse 21, the virgin daughter of Zion appears in parallel to Jerusalem, and I'm reading, she despises you, she scorns you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. And in verse 31, it is Mount Zion that appears in parallel to Jerusalem, and I'm quoting, for out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. Thus, it is clear why the name Zion must be assumed to be a late literary name for Jerusalem, which mainly characterizes prophetic and poetic literature. The term developed as an additional epithet for Jerusalem in this literature, from which it also made its way into the later historiographical descriptions of the city's history, and is limited to the contexts of the days of David's conquest of Jerusalem, the dedication of the temple in the days of Solomon, and the miraculous rescue of the city from the hands of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. These are three crucial events in the development of the image of the city in the Deuteronomistic ideology and historiography. Returning to the description of the conquest of Jerusalem by David in the second book of Kings, chapter 5, verse 7, it gives a brief summary of the event. I'm reading. Nevertheless, David seized the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. This verse connects nicely the words of the Jebusites to David in verse 6 and David's words and respond in verse 8. Verses centered on double statements with a clear symmetry between them and with an emphasis on the verb said, amar, and the contrast between the words of the Jebusites and those of David. In response to the words of the Jebusites in verse 6, who said to David, "You will not come in here except you take away the blind and the lame," the answer in verse 8 is, and David said, on that day, whomever smites a Jebusite, let him touch the water shaft, and the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. And in contrast to the citation of the words of the blind and the lame in verse 6, David will not come in here, the answer is in verse 8 says, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. That is, in contrast to the Jebusite statement that David will not be able to conquer Jerusalem without removing the blind and the lame, David instructs on how to strike them And in contrast to the Jebusite statement that David will not come into to Jerusalem, a statement is made according to which the blind and the lame will not come into the temple. Following other scholars and commentators, also my assumption is that verses 7, 9, and 10 are late editorial additions. The concluding and connecting sentence in verse 7, David sees the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David, as well as verse 9, which continues it and describes what was the stronghold after its conquest. And David dwelt in the stronghold and called the city of David, and David built around about from Milo inward. And certainly the concluding historiographic description in verse 10, according to which and David continued to grow greater and greater, and Yahweh, the God of hosts, was with him. All of these are more a later addition and not part of any ancient story. Rather, their addition was intended to connect the foreign city with the dynasty of the royal house and give it sanctity that is lacked back when it was still considered a foreign city. The addition in verse 9 relates the beginning of the story, which had described using the verb yoshev, that the Jebusites were the inhabitants of the land, to the reality after the conquest of Jerusalem, according to which, using the same verb, vayeshev, David dwelt in the stronghold. The summary in verse 10 also ties together a knot that begins in verse 6, with a description emphasized that the verb vayelech, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem, and ends with the use of the same verb, vayelech, and David continued to grow greater and greater, vayelech loch v'gadol, and Yahweh, the God of hosts, was with him. What is left of the story is, on the one hand, the description in verse 6, according to which, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here except you take away the blind and the lame," who are saying, David will not come in here. And on the other hand, the solution in verse 8, according to which, and David said on that day, "Whomever smite a Jebusite, let him touch the water shaft, and the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul." Therefore, it is said, "The blind and the lame shall not come into the house." Scholars disagree on the interpretation of the words of the Jebusites to David in verse 6. In the Masoretic text, this verse is presented as part of the words of the Jebusites, who said to David, "You will not come in here except you take away the blind and the lame." While in the Qumran scroll that was found in Qumran desert and kept the same text, the word "except" was omitted, and the word "hasircha," take away, has been replaced with the word "hesitu," incited, which in Hebrew it's very close. You can write it very similarly. According to the Qumran scroll, the words of the Jebusites to David should be read as follow: "Who said to David, 'You will not come in here,' because the blind and the lame incited them, saying, 'David will not come in here.'" This means that the words of the Jebusites to David are the results of the incitement of the blind and the lame, a meaning that is also supported by the text of the Septuagint translation. The text in Qumran and the Septuagint makes sense and apparently preserves the earlier and more reliable version of the original biblical text standing the base of the book of Samuel. In the Masoretic text, it is possible that there was a slight but significant alteration in the copying of the text from hesitu, incited, to hesircha, take away. We cannot tell whether this is a copyist mistake or a deliberate change in the text in some later periods. In any case, it seems that the original meaning of the text is that the Jebusites were incited away by the blind and the lame and trusted in their magic. believing that David would not succeed in conquering the city. This text also provides an explanation for David's hatred of the blind and the lame, as described in verse 8, and the reason they were forbidden to enter the temple, as they were hated by David's soul. The combination blind and lame is special and appeared in the entire Hebrew Bible only 6 times, 3 of which are here in the story of the conquest of Jerusalem by David in the second book of Kings, chapter 5, verse 6, and twice in verse 8. Apart from these 3 times, the phrase blind and lame also appears in Leviticus 21, verse 18, in Deuteronomy 15, verse 21, as well as in Jeremiah 31, verse 8. In Leviticus, this combination appears within the overall definition of priests with disabilities who would not be able to offer sacrifice to God in the temple. In Deuteronomy, this conjunction is defined as a birth defect that would cause the rejection of a sacrifice of the firstborn in cattle and sheep in the temple, not people. And in Jeremiah, this conjunction appears as part of a broad inclusion of those who would return from exile when, I'm quoting, the blind and the lame, the woman with child, and her who is travail together. A great company, they shall return here. Hence, the role of the blind and the lame in the story of the conquest of Jerusalem in second book of Samuel is special and probably preserves a memory whose origin is unclear, but which is linked to the event of David's conquest of the city. It also preserves the custom of prohibiting the entry of blind and lame into the temple and the memory of David's hatreds of them. So this is a kind of original seed that was kept in the story. Following the description of the conquest of the city in verse 7, verse 8 relates that, and David said to them, whoever smites a Jebusites, Vayiga batzinor, let him touch the water tunnel, something like this. The Hebrew term tzínor is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible only once more in Psalms 42, verse 7, where it is written, deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. Scholars differed on the meaning of this term. Some suggested it be interpreted as an organ in the body. Julius Wellhausen, followed by Gustav Delman and others, suggested that Tzínor refers to the Jebusite's male genitalia, while William Albright suggested that it refers to the neck of the blind and the lame. The meaning of touching these organs, in accordance with David's instruction, whoever smites a Jebusite, let him touch the male genitalia or the neck of the blind and the lame, is unknown, making the story less clear. Understanding the command of touching as meaning of physical injury creates grammatical problems with the structure of the sentence and also creates a meaning that is difficult for me to accept. Eliezer Sukenik, and following him Yigael Yadin, relied on the Onkelos translation of the Old Testament into Aramaic and suggested that the meaning of the word tzínor is a weapon, a kind of a pitchfork with 3 teeth, with which David's heroes climbed the wall of Jerusalem and conquered it. I cannot accept this explanation either, as it does not correspond to the structure of the sentence, creates difficulty with understanding of the order of actions described in the story, and seems to apply too technical an approach towards interpreting a problematic term, without linking the understanding of the term to the sentence meaning with the broader context of the text. In Psalms, The Tzínor is mentioned in a sequence of contexts mainly reminiscent of the sound of a flowing water. Deep calls to deep, at the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. The verb calls and the mention of the roar of your waterfalls in comparison to billows and waves led most commentators to explain the tzínor as meaning of stream or waterfall. Thus, as early as 1878, following the discovery of water shafts, that underground tunnel that led water from the Gihon spring at the bottom of the eastern slope of the city of David, within the Kidron stream into the southern part of the city, researchers following Samuel Birch suggested that the term Tzínor refers to the ancient waterway system of Jerusalem. Other researchers also took this direction, speculating that the conquest of Jerusalem was attained by penetrating to the city through its waterways or by blocking the water source so the city's residents until they were forced to surrender. The study of the water system of Jerusalem has made a lot of progress since the discovery of Warren's shaft, and it turns out that things are more complicated. The dating of the various systems has been perfected, and above all, the critical reading of the biblical descriptions has made it clear to many researchers that this short description of the conquest of Jerusalem in the days of David provides no description of battle, conquest, or war. Moreover, the act of touching the tzínor is considering late in terms of the time sequence for all the other actions describing in the story, maybe following the battle. Following the realization that the main memory of the conquest of the city in the days of David relates to the memory of those blind and lame, the people that David's fought against them or was against them, and David's instruction about touching the tzínor, Nadav Naaman suggested that David's commandment to touch the tzínor was made for the purpose of purification after the war. As such, David's words must be understood to mean that any of his men who struck the Jebusites should touch a stream or waterfall or something that is in a water tunnel, apparently for the purpose of purification, as an act designed to remove the impurity that might have resulted from this strike. The need for purification is consistent with the statement in the later part of verse 8, which forbids the blind and the lame from entering the temple, not only because of David's hatred for them, but also apparently because of the impurity they bring. Therefore, it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. In my opinion, given the emphasis in Psalms on the sound of the rushing water, deep calls to deep, and the roar of your waterfalls, all your waves and your billows have gone over me, it must be assumed that this is one of the tunnels that drained or diverted water in the city of David, and where the memory of the purification of David's warriors after the conquest of the city is preserved. I would like to argue that Tzínor was the place bearing the memory. It was no longer a tunnel from which water was drawn or within which water was stored or transported from place to place. Perhaps it was a tunnel that had already gone out of use, or a tunnel where those who were in need of purification could dip. In any case, this memory was tied to the story of David's conquest of the city and was passed down orally through the generations, perhaps as a prevalent custom in Jerusalem and perhaps as a tradition links to that shaft or tunnel which was known and familiar to everyone who lived in Jerusalem. In 2008, Eilat Mazar reported on a tunnel that was uncovered behind the stepped stone structure in the city of David and linked it to the Tzínor mentioned in the story of David's conquest of Jerusalem. This tunnel was discovered in a natural notch in the northern part of the hip of the eastern slope of the city of David, and according to Mazar, it was used even before the construction of the stepped stone structure, so very early in the history of the city, and continued to be used throughout most of the First Temple era. The historical question still stands. Archaeologists will continue inquiring into the plan of this tunnel and the phases of its use. Additional tunnels might potentially be discovered that were dug and used in different periods in the history of Jerusalem. Historians and biblical scholars will continue reconstructing the connection between these tunnels, the history of the city, and the story of the conquest of Jerusalem in the days of David. I would just suggest that the very basic memory that existed in Jerusalem of David's conquest of the city was neither about the conquest process nor about the war between David and the ancient inhabitants of Jerusalem. We know almost nothing about these issues. Was it a real war? What did David do with the Jebusite population that was captured in the city? What happened in the city of Jerusalem immediately after it was conquered by David? There is no information about any of these matters in the biblical description, and it seems that those who compiled them lacked details about these issues as well. The only memory we have of this founding event, in which the king who founded a dynasty and the kingdom of Judah conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital, was of the involvement of lame and blind people in this process, and that anyone who struck them had to be cleansed. Therefore, in my opinion, the subject of the memory in this case was a tunnel that had water in it, which a rushing sound and flow was heard, and where, according to the memory, David's warriors were purified after the war. This was the seed of the memory preserved in Jerusalem through the centuries. Those who lived in Jerusalem or visited it preserved this memory, regardless of whether the tunnel continued to be used or for this purpose in later days. Thus, it was written down at a later period as the core of the story of the conquest of Jerusalem, but also as part of a broad and comprehensive historical story about the ancient days of David. There is very little additional information about Jerusalem in the days of David, and what little information exists also seems to derive from buildings, palaces, places, and objects that were in Jerusalem and were known to anyone who lived in the city or visited it. The construction of the palace of Jerusalem is described in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, verse 11. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, who built David's house. Was there a chronicle that described this construction project? Or a royal inscription? There is no evidence of this, and the information contained in this verse is also very basic and may stem from a special Phoenician-style architecture of the palace, which was different from the local style, from the building material that were in the palace and included cedar trees. After all, in 2nd book of Samuel 7, verse 2, the palace is also called the house of cedar, and perhaps also from the cutting and chiseling style of the stones. That is, in this case, as well as the structure could have been the one that carried the memory. And since many other memories linked Hiram, king of Tyre, to historical events from the days of David and Solomon, recounted in the first book of Kings, chapter 5, 7, 8, and 9, the link to this king required no additional information. The information about the inhabitants of Jerusalem in the days of David stemmed from traditions and other stories tied to that era. We know of Uriah the Hittite because of the information that was linked to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and perhaps the great importance of the story of Uriah was in the emphasis that King Solomon, son of David, was not an illegitimate child, and the first son born to David and Bathsheba after they slept together while Bathsheba was still married to Uriah. He died, according to the very detailed story in the second book of Samuel, chapter 12. Whereas Solomon was born to David and Bathsheba only after Uriah's death and after David and Bathsheba were already married. The information about the Araunah, the Jebusites, threshing floor also didn't come from a written chronicle, and the story about the purchase of the threshing floor in the second book of Samuel, chapter 24, verses 18 to 25, was based on information about the location of the temple in Jerusalem, which became the most important and holiest place in the city. Question about the ownership of the threshing floor on which the temple was built preoccupied everyone who visited it, and the house of David's ownership of the land of the temple and the temple itself was an essential issue in the relationship between the royal house and the priesthood and the temple. The memory of the ancient altar that David had built in the place where Solomon later built the temple is what gave the place its sanctity. And the story of the plague that stopped when the altar was constructed gave it the divine touch it needed as the source of the sanctity. And David built there an altar to Yahweh and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So Yahweh responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. Stories that connected the temple and the palace further occupy the biblical historiography. The information about these also stem from objects, places, and buildings that existed in Jerusalem throughout the First Temple area. We will continue to deal with this in the following chapters as well.